The Premier, Daniel Andrews, was asked about your report that they're heading towards a New Zealand-style lockdown. He didn't want to get into the specifics of that, what country's done what, but the fact is this is very much on the radar right now, given what we're facing in Victoria.
That's my clear understanding from a well-placed federal source who said to me it may be their only solution. Think New Zealand in terms of restrictions. That's what was put to me. You saw Brett Sutton. He wanted to downplay the New Zealand-type lockdown, the Victorian Chief Health Officer, and Daniel Andrews not rule out such measures. Let's have a look at this graphic, if we can, on what this actually means, because it's pretty full on. If we get to this, you're going to have things like construction, butchers, hairdressers shut, far harder than the shutdowns we had in March of restaurants, cafes, pubs, etc. Here's what would actually be open: supermarkets, food banks, pharmacies, liquor stores, a limit of one customer at a time, dairies, corner stores, and everything that's shut includes everything from butchers to fruit shops. So hairdressers, construction, just everything pretty much shut, except your bare essential services. And you can see why a government would be reluctant to do this, but the numbers aren't going away, are they, despite the shutdowns? Now, one argument put to me today, Kieran, was that essentially you're having 200, 300, 400 cases a day. If you let it rip and there was no shutdowns, it'd be 400, in 3 days 800, in 3 days 1,600. So the shutdowns are having an effect, but are they having enough of an effect? This is a note sent to me by a federal... I'll talk about this curve in a minute, but a federal MP a short time ago said of Daniel Andrews' press conference, every time he tries to blame Victorians, the punters get angrier, because Daniel Andrews was saying not enough people are doing the right thing. Bear in mind it was the quarantining mess that got Victoria into this state. This MP said to me, I think they're trying to hold the line before making a call on a further lockdown, which would be an even bigger admission of guilt. So some strong words there. Look at that curve. That was what I was talking about there. 300, 400 cases a day, really worrying that it's not. You can see it's growing every sort of fourth day, but it's not growing exponentially. But there's no hope in sight from that. You'd expect some moves, given shutdowns, even local shutdowns happened about 3 weeks ago. No hope in sight of a decline, really. And that's the real concern in terms of this. Let's have a listen to Daniel Andrews talk then about a New Zealand-style lockdown.
There's no announcements to be made today about any changes to the rules and whether you want to term them, what number you want to put beside the stage, or what country around the world you want to compare them to. That's not the way in which we're thinking. That's not the sort of work that we do. These matters are under constant review based on the data each day, the trends each week, and some of the features that I've just gone through in some detail, understanding the problem.
No announcement today, not ruling it out. But let's see what happens with those cases. It's certainly under consideration in coming days, as I understand it. Now, another one to downplay the New Zealand model today was Brett Sutton. Have a listen.
Everything is under consideration, but again, to go to a particular model of lockdown that worked for one country at one point in time is not the solution. We have to understand what the dynamics of transmission are in Victoria at this point in time. It may well be that it's an awful impost on the economy and on people's lives with no material benefit if we go to a New Zealand-style lockdown. New Zealand didn't have significant community transmission. Again, they were identifying the close contacts of international travellers, and it was a much, much more straightforward contact tracing process, as it was in Victoria through the first phase. So I wouldn't make assumptions that harder, more constrained lockdown is necessarily the way to go.
So our reporter, Gabriella Power, then asked Daniel Andrews whether he would consider postcode by postcode lockdowns, more severe restrictions on certain areas, and he gave an interesting response there.
When we're in a position or when we need to make further announcements about rules, we'll do that. That's what we've done all the way through. Obviously, these numbers, well, you're asking me a hypothetical question and then wanting me to put a timeline on it. Ultimately, when the data tells us we need to go further, we will. until then, speculating about these things doesn't serve any real purpose.
So earlier this year, Daniel Andrews, in March, when there were 166 cases a day in Victoria, not the 480 we have now, and that included people coming from overseas, not the community transmission it all is now, talked about stage 4 restrictions, suggested that to the federal government. And here's Daniel Andrews later talking about what important role he played in all of that. What a turnaround it is today.
I made a judgment, and Gladys made a judgment as well, that this thing needed a big jolt. We needed to take a big step. I was never going to have a situation, David, where in 6 months' time I look back and said, I wish we'd done more and we'd done it faster. This is life and death, and I think the jolt that and the big step that we took that day and since has absolutely saved lives.
So is another big jolt on the way, or because the quarantining took place under Andrews' government, does he have a different approach for that reason now? It certainly is a different situation in New South Wales to Victoria, where police ran the hotel quarantining operation. The virus didn't escape, compared to health being in charge of it in Victoria. The New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller detailed this difference in an interview with me on Monday.
I think New South Wales has taken a unique approach to the emergency, and the Premier in late March made a decision to put New South Wales Police in charge of the emergency as the combat agency, Andrew, and I'm sure there was a few people looking at that with interest, and we're the only state or territory to have police in charge. And the reason was it really turned into more of a security operation than it has a health operation.
Speaking to you earlier in the week, now just go back to that Daniel Andrews comment on the ABC that we played there, talking life and death, and we needed a jolt. Well, if you were talking life and death then, and now with the death toll rising every day in Victoria, one would think, if he's of the same mind that he was only a month or two ago, that he's got to be thinking about a similar sort of jolt, because right now these numbers are huge.
Has to be and is, isn't he? Surely. I mean, this is the bizarre thing about this story. I remember us live on air revealing to people on March 22, I think it was, that New South Wales and Victoria were about to shut down. Even outside the National Cabinet process, the premiers were going to put out statements. And at that time, the federal government was saying, don't shut down or lock down too much or too early. Now I've got federal sources suggesting to me it's the only way, and Daniel Andrews apparently resisting it. I mean, we had a situation in Victoria too, people couldn't play golf. That's pretty damn low risk at one point. And now the numbers are the sort we've not seen in Australia, and yet Andrews at the moment seems to be buying time, just hoping that in the next 2 or 3 days they go down. Brett Sutton there, I think it's a bit of a concern. He says New Zealand, even a New Zealand-style lockdown won't fix it, Kieran, because then you just wonder where Victoria is at and where Australia is at now with the virus because of this quarantining bungle. Now, this federal source, they said to me that locking down Victoria would really hurt the Victorian economy, but it might be necessary for Australia, because it seems only a matter of time otherwise that the virus will leak into other states, particularly New South Wales.
It's been a complete reversal in the message that we've heard from the state vis-a-vis the federal government when it comes to the restrictions. In March, it was Daniel Andrews, as you point out, pushing with Gladys Berejiklian, and as we heard in that comment, pushing for tougher restrictions. Now, with the numbers rising in his state, we had the worst number on, for the nation today, and that happened entirely in Victoria. It's a very different message. And Brett Sutton, the Chief Medical Officer, in repudiating the comparison with New Zealand, says we have to be more targeted, but this community transmission seems to be more broad than a targeted response would be appropriate for.
And there are concerns I'm aware of about regional Victoria in particular, where the contact tracing is not so strong. You've had outbreaks in abattoirs. You've got less ability there to contact trace. It's not as easy as in Melbourne, it seems, and it just seems like a situation out of control. There's only so many options you have, and press conferences saying people aren't doing the right thing probably isn't going to solve it. Hopefully it helps. hopefully people take heed of the message. But unfortunately for Victoria, it seems to be heading in one direction, Kieran.
Yeah.